So for me, I don't want to dwell too long on this, but people always say to me, Scott, why do you invest overseas? Why did you live in London for 9 years? And the honest answer is that I'm half Zimbabwean and I'm half South African. So my mother's side of the family is South African, 4 generations, and my father's side is Zimbabwean, 3 generations. And I absolutely love Africa. I'm completely passionate about it. I'm not going to sit here and badmouth it. It's got nothing to do with that. However, I am realistic in terms of my own expectations of what I want for me and my family. So for me, there's 5 things that are very important in terms of why I personally invest overseas. The first one is the rule of law. The second one is political and economic instability. The third one is wealth preservation. The fourth one is, unfortunately, when people try and get their money out, they actually lose money. And the fifth one is currency devaluation. And just to remind you quickly, the most important thing for me with rule of law, I bought my last investment property in South Africa in 2010. The reason being is that in 2010, the cops came to arrest me because my tenant hadn't paid. Now my tenant hadn't paid for 4 months. I decided that I would help them out because they obviously had a security problem, and I put a security gate on their door to make sure that they had no further security to get my rent paid. And unfortunately, in the process, I was deemed to be the criminal who was now locking them out of their own house and got arrested by the police. Now, at that same time, it just happened to be that the lady worked for F&B Home Loans, and I happened to have my loan with F&B, and when I went to see F&B, they couldn't care less. One of their employees from F&B Home Loans hadn't paid me for 4 months. And I just realized at the time, this is ridiculous. I, as the property owner, am the criminal. Whereas, believe it or not, and I'm sure Tony will attest to this, in a first world country, it's the most amazing phenomenon. The rights of property ownership are protected. I know it sounds like a foreign concept.
It is a foreign concept.
The second thing for me is political and economic instability, and I think it's summed up best by this gentleman.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How is the morning? How is the economy?
President Jacob Zuma knows all too well that the performance of the economy is no laughing matter. With strike season looming large, he's urged business and unions to avoid drawn-out battles.
Given the beginning of the collective bargaining season in both mining and other industries, we call on parties to recognize the impact of the industrial relations environment on jobs and development.
Desperate to avoid a repeat of last year's tragic events at Marikana, Zuma has mandated his deputy, Kgalebo Motlanthe, to lead talks in the mining sector.
He's meeting, for an example, NUM. He's also meeting AMCO, as well as NACTU, where AMCO is now affiliated, as well as COSATU. So we are not meeting others and not others. I don't think the government has taken any stance that takes sides.
South Africa's growth rate has fallen below 2%, pushing the rand to a 4-year low against the US dollar. And Zuma has appealed to the media to go easy on the country.
Ladies and gentlemen, just report nicely, okay, about South Africa. Thank you very much.
Paul Mgambi, Pretoria.
News that moves. enca.com.
So my objective here is not to be negative at all. I'm just being pragmatic. So on your USB, you should all of you been given a USB? You should all have a USB. For those of you who had the extravaganza, if you want to return your other one, it's fine. No, I'm joking. But it's got all the updated information, and most importantly, it's got all these articles, okay, that I'm about to show you. So in the interest of saving trees, we haven't printed them for everyone, but they're all on your USB. And for me, I'm just going to run through some articles today, because this is the whole purpose of this breakfast, is to keep you updated. You're all busy, and so rather than spending 6 weeks trying to get all the information in 1 hour, I can give it to you. So who follows Kies Broekmans, the F&B economist? Yeah? What do you find from him?
He's a pretty clever guy.
Yeah.
I enjoy his style.
I got an email yesterday.
He's just not forget to be used.
Oh, okay.
I mean, he gives it to you as it is.
Okay. Anyone else? Got any? Someone else at the back?
Same thing.
Same thing. I will be honest with you. I've learned more from Kees Brokemans about economics than I learned at university when I studied economics. Because exactly what you said, he makes economics simple for the layman, I believe. I've learned more about economics from reading stuff. So there's an article here which literally came through. Yesterday was, what are we today? Wednesday. I got this on Monday. And I've just got some points here. Given the deteriorating condition of the SA economy in terms of slowing growth, downscaling of the growth forecast, progressive weaker rand, loss of investor confidence, risk of more debt downgrades, and upside risk to inflation, are also highlighted recently by Saab, the inclination may be to extrapolate such deterioration in the absence of clear political leadership addressing the key issues. He goes on to talk about the concern that with the way things are going from a leadership perspective, so not a macro perspective, a micro perspective, what we're in control of, that the last time our debt got called in this country was in 1985. And the whole, I mean, you can see here, it's a 5-page article, I'm not going to read your whole thing. But the whole thing comes down to, the very last line is, one hopes the micro policymakers will choose wisely with only national interest in mind. I would highly recommend reading that article. It's on your USB. The second one for me is that it's pretty much been highlighted by that newspaper article, but it's just talking about the markets defying Zuma, where effectively he came out and tried to instill confidence and unfortunately had the complete negative effect. The third article for me, which was from Brendan actually sent to me, and I read this 2 days ago, this one is extremely concerning to me. It's by a research organization and it talks about the riots in Brazil and Turkey and how they can be predicted based on inflation trends and what is actually happening. Riots have broken out across Brazil and Turkey. India, Argentina, and South Africa are next on the list. Believe it or not, these things can be predicted by looking at inflation stats and monetary debasement rates. 6 months ago, Johannesburg-based research house ETM Analytics predicted this would happen because these two countries are among the worst monetary abusers in the world. The research appears to show a direct link between inflation and social unrest. So it says this has everything to do with the fact that the South African Reserve Bank and the commercial banking system has been flooding the system with newly minted fiat money for the last 3 years, pushing the Rand-US dollar exchange to its lowest level in years. To have a strengthening currency, one needs a prudent central bank maintaining positive real interest rates, not printing new base money to hand to the banks, which they can then lend to creditworthy people, while those people who don't have access to credit markets or are not savvy enough to invest in inflationary sectors are becoming poorer. And quite concerning, and you can't see this, but South Africa is third worst in the entire world based on income and discrepancies and problems with inflation in terms of where we are, in terms of their predictions. The whole thing that they talk about here is that there's a direct difference between CCI and CPI. So it's two different ways of actually determining what inflation are. And I think really from my perspective, this wouldn't have made me as concerned unless I'd done quite a lot of work with Clem Santa. Who here has been to any of Clem Santa's speeches in the last year? Okay, so can anyone give us some update in terms of what Clem Santa said? There are lots of red flags. And what did he specifically talk about that was one of the biggest problems?
Labour unrest as well.
Okay, so labour unrest, it's exactly right. But he actually talks about the concern of the Arab Spring and what's happened in the countries north of Africa and how we've got 10 million youths that are unemployed. And when they basically sat with the political leadership in North Africa, and they said, why did it happen? They said the reason it happened was that you've got a whole lot of people that are unemployed and are feeling unheard, and ultimately they go towards the unrest. So the concerning thing from Clem Santa, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, I've done webinars with him, we've got live talks, but the concerning thing for me with Clem Santa is that I did an event with him in September last year, and he's got 3 probabilities for South Africa. 50% is the best case scenario, so there's a 50% probability we stay in the top performing 54 countries in the world. Then there's a 40% chance of us dropping to the second scenario, and then there's a 10% probability of us going to failed state, which is Zimbabwe, Syria, etc. That was in September last year. Yep. I understand. Yeah, so when I did the webinar with him in February, because in September it was just before Marikana. In February when we redid it, it changed to 50, 25, 25, exactly like I said. And this gentleman actually beat me to it. So you've won the first prize. You get to choose. You can either have a 10 Rand or $1. You'll have $1. There we are. For those of you who've already stolen the currency, well, we know you South Africans. So that's exactly it. It's 25%. And that for me is an extremely concerning thing. You know, I'm not purporting, I've been following Clem Santa for about 5 years. I remember less than a year and a half ago when it was like 60-40, I think it was 60-40 North actually, in terms of how that's changed. So that article about the unrest and you know, Clem Santa, for those of you who don't know, is the chairman on Anglo board. So he's very closely tied to what's happening in terms of labour relations. The third one, and I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. If you want to go, I've got whole webinars on this. But most importantly, it's what's happening with the land in terms of the expropriation bill and how they're actually changing the onus of land rights from the government to the individual. Basically, they're wanting to change the right to lawful, reasonable, and procedurally fair administrative action, LIMSA week third. So what they're going to do is they want to be able to identify land for redistribution, followed by a notice of expropriation, after which the expropriating authority takes ownership and possession of the property. It is only after transfer of ownership that the question of compensation is considered. And for me, this all comes from the Center for Constitutional Rights. So this is not me just trying to be negative here. And she talks about the 5 most important things. So basically, it's shifting the constitutional burden of land reform to the individual owners. It'll have an impact on the property market as a whole. It will, because effectively the whole compensation then will come up. It will threaten the stability of the agricultural industry, and it'll affect cooperation between the agricultural sector and government, and ultimately it will undermine investor confidence. And for me, from a wealth preservation perspective, that is critically important.
Is that basically agricultural land, or is it all properties?
Well, climate's
Your house in Sandton, there's going to be
No, because even look at Zimbabwe, they didn't necessarily expropriate a house in Borda. Okay, but you were with me in London back in 2004, 2005 at events when they were doing that, and do foreign investors know the difference?
Well, it's spooked, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, do you think
basically the policy is to do with agricultural land?
it's to do with the fact that the land redistribution is not taking place fast enough. I have no problem with land redistribution. I think it's critical for our country when 5% of the population owns 95% of the land. But it's because of service delivery and because of inability. You can't just take the land and it over. So to answer your question, when we were in London, foreign investors, or any investors for that matter, get spooked, to use your word exactly. And so whether they're taking the farm or whether they're taking a house in Sandton doesn't make any difference. It affects the rights to property ownership, which ultimately affects the entire fundamental foundation of wealth. Yes or no?
Well, yeah, it will undermine people's attitude to investment. But what I want to understand is that the policy is largely directed to agricultural land, or would they put encroach on, well, it's not going to be a house in Sandton, but what about your 5 acres of a house out in North Riding or Ramsey or something like that sort of
It
thing?
can be taken under that land appropriation. What it means, basically what they're saying, because I've got that issue with the piece of land out there at the moment with the road that they want to build, is if the government deems that that land is necessary for a government project, they'll take it. Finish the story.
I think the purpose of today, and this debate is fantastic, but the purpose of today is to just make people aware of it. If it's something that concerns you, go and do more research, in terms of what's happening. But not just to sit naively thinking things aren't happening in terms of where we're at. And the bottom line is, for me, this exact building that we're sitting in right here, a bank gave financing to a developer to build this building, etc., etc. If I don't care if there's a farm 1,000 k's from here that's been taken, it will impact the value of this building. Am I right or wrong? The fourth one is, again, if you've heard me do any presentations before, there was research that came out in 2010 that 80% of South Africans that invest overseas, now it's not just property, whether it's property, stocks, bonds, whatever, actually lose money. And we've done quite a lot of research on this, and our business partner Brendan and Henny actually tried to work on why it was. And our number one reason is that people make crisis investments. They wait until the rand is falling, they jump on an airplane, they fly to London on a business trip for 3 days, and they say to themselves, well, I'm going to buy a property. And to be honest, if you think about it the other way around, if a British person was to arrive in Johannesburg on a 3-day business trip and was going to buy a good investment, what are the chances? Okay? A guy from Atlanta flies out here and rocks up and is going to buy a property. Is it going to happen? He comes on a hunting trip and buys a property at the same time. You know, so the chance of us going to Disney World and buying a property at the same time are equally small, you know. And that's why, unfortunately, people have the wrong information, the wrong partners, they underestimate the cash flows, they don't work with people that focus on the international property, and for me, they also underestimate the costs that are involved. One of the things that I learned the hard way, unfortunately, I'm very skeptical of off-plan developments. I bought, Peter will know this, in London in 2008. I had pre-approved finance from Barclays Bank, Barclays Capital. Okay, now, let's be honest, is that fairly good pre-approval? Yes or no? Yeah, I mean, they signed it off, I would have thought it's pretty much as good as anything. Then the GFC came along, they went, that piece of paper, thanks for you, not so much. Okay, now I've got my 10% deposit down, and I'm supposed to get financing in 2 years. What I don't like about off-plan, I don't know where we'll be in 2 years. So I've become much more pragmatic in terms of I like to buy something I can see, I know what I'm getting, I know what the results are right now today, and I don't have to worry about the risks I can't control in 2 years. Does that make sense? There is a report, if you're interested, on the 6 things you need to know, which based on Brendan and I and Jaco's experience, you know, we've been doing this a long time just to help you. Whether you work with us or not, we don't care, we just don't want you to go overseas and make mistakes. And then lastly for me, I asked who was here, was at the extravaganza. Who was on the webinar, or any webinar? We've had 3 of them with James Painter. Okay, excellent. So, interesting enough, James, if you look at his website right now, he said that, this is the front page of his website, he said, are you still looking around for reasons why the rand has moved when it's too late to protect yourself? Or are you using a tool that shows the future with an 80% accuracy so that you can take action? Now, interestingly enough, we did a webinar with him in January. This is the 16th of January, and he told us that around May, June, we would reach the 10 rand target. Since 2005, he's had an accuracy of 81% using patterns. The best way to describe what he does, it's like the weather. You know, the weatherman is not 100% sure that it's going to be sunny today, but based on weather patterns, he can tell you with a lot more accuracy than we can as to whether it's going to be sunny or rainy. Does that make sense? So this here is what's happened to the rand since 1990 to 2013. So we can see it's gone up and down, it's had some spikes. The average devaluation is 5.6%. Now this was the graph that we used in March when the rand was sitting at about 8.80, 9 rand to the dollar. Can anyone tell me what the average is? Because they will probably know because they were on the webinar, what the average is now across the whole, because of where the rand's changed. So if we take since 1990 to today, 23 years, what is the average now? It's no longer 5.6%. Anyone?
Not around 6%.
It is around 6%. Congratulations. Would you mind just coming up to the front quickly?
Making money.
Okay, you got a choice. You got 300 rand or $20. Well done.
So obviously you guys are ready to take part, you're going to make some money.
I'm sitting in the front. Shorter distance.
So yeah, interestingly enough, that graph has changed and it's 6% now. Just to run through for those of you who weren't on the webinar, it's not just a sentiment thing. It's not just because people don't like what Zoom is saying or not saying. Unfortunately, it's based on fundamentals. And there's 2 major fundamentals that drive it. The first one is our productivity. So the blue line is our productivity since 1981, again, and the maroon line is our productivity, is our trading partners' productivity. And you can see the decrease. The yellow line is the difference between the two. So our productivity has vastly reduced against our trading partners over the last 30 odd years. Our unit labor cost. So the blue is us in terms of unit labor cost, and the maroon is our trading partners. So again, there's a stark contrast between the labor cost in South Africa versus our trading partners. And someone asked a very good question on the webinar. Why 2008? Why does it stop? Because some of our new trading partners like China, the research doesn't go back far enough. So it's very difficult to assimilate. But can we agree that that trend is not necessarily diminishing, it's actually increasing? Does that make sense? Anyone disagree with that? So in March, when we did the extravaganza, you can see here this date, it's the 6th of March 2013. James sat with us live. We have a presentation if you want to go and watch it on the internet. And he told us that in the next 3 months, we would be in a target range of 950 to 1030. That green box there. So he's not 100% sure, but the target range in the next 3 months would be between 950 to 1030. Does anyone know what we were this morning? Or are this morning?
10-10.
What is it?
10-10.
10-10. 10-10. So can we agree that he's pretty spot on? 3 months later. And the frustrating thing for me is that we have 202 people come to the extravaganza and hear this and be shown this, and then not actually, only about 20 of them took action. And there are 180 people that are sitting there going, if only I'd bought when the Rand was 880, 890, which is what it was at the extravaganza. And so for me, this research, now on your USB is all his research. And what he's also agreed to do is for the next month you can get his service for free. So log in, see how it works. I would highly recommend it. I personally pay the subscription for it.
Scott, can I jump in?
Yeah.
I did a bit of a spreadsheet before I followed James Painter's stuff, just on the history of the Rand versus the dollar and the euro and all the rest of that stuff. And basically, if in 1996, because that's as far back as my research went, in 1996, if I had R1 million in the bank with no inflation, no growth, no capital whatsoever, and all I did was I kept it in South Africa, in today's money it would be worth roughly 113,000 Rand in global buying power, in terms of where the dollar's gone. If you just moved it to the States, you didn't buy property, you didn't get any growth on it, no interest, no nothing. If you just did that, it would be worth between 1.7 and 1.8 million Rand today. And that's not investing in anything else except transferring currency from one country to another. And that trend is not slowing down, we can see it's accelerating. And that was my own internal research, it wasn't following this guy.
I think the important thing is that as a property investor, I don't really care whether the Rand is going tomorrow or next week or even in the next couple of months, because I invest personally with a 5-year view plus. So what's more important to me is that over the next couple of years, James's research is pointing that the target area is going to be somewhere between 14 and 21. The only thing he's not 100% sure is how long it's going to take to get there and exactly how high it's going to go. And you can read all his documents in terms of, there's a whole lot of barrier lines and everything else. If you read his research right now, he says the best case scenario with about a 30% probability we should get back to about 930 in the next couple of weeks or so. But quite soon it'll break through the 1050, and once we go there, we'll start to go into new areas. So this for me is a very basic graph that I put together, and for me this is my Rand purchasing power, and this is the cost of investment. Now the cost of investment could be a skiing holiday once a year. It could be the fact that my son is 15 months old now, and how do I know he might actually want to go to a foreign university. It might be the fact that I want to go live in another country one day. It might be the fact I just want to buy a property. It doesn't matter what it is. It's different for everybody. But for me, the challenge is that the Rand is doing that, and that the cost is doing that. And ultimately, it's my problems or my freedom that is being implicated in terms of where I actually am. And you know, I thought about this last night when my son was having that fit, and we put him in the car, and all I did was drive him straight to Santon Mediclinic. And not at one point did I stop to think, you know, shit, can I afford this? Or is this the best place? Or, you know, how am I going to pay the bill or whatever? And when I was sitting there last night, I thought, I'm in such a privileged position to be able to do that, not to have to worry whether medical aid will cover it or not cover it or anything else. And for me, it's the exact same scenario in 20 years when he finds it out and says, Dad, I want to go to Harvard. You just want to do whatever is best for your kids, you know. I'm not being melodramatic. It's just the exact same analogy for me as to what we're trying to do in terms of freedom. So, just to give you some research, I actually managed to get the research for America yesterday, Brendan, if you heard that tonight. But unfortunately, I've been struggling to get it for America, so I've got it for Australia. It takes quite a long time to plot this. But from 1978, which is as far back as you can go, if you've invested the exact same amount of money in South Africa and in Australia, today you would have a net asset value of about 1.2 million rand in South Africa. So the 24th of June 2013. If you invested in Australia, you'd have a net asset value of over 4.5 million rand. Yep.
What percentage of that is due to the currency depreciation? What is the different?
It's interesting, I've got all the graphs if you're interested. It's probably 50-50. Okay. Like, our property market hasn't necessarily done better or worse. You've obviously also got to take into account inflation, you know, in terms of the nominal growth versus real growth, you know, in terms of it. But all I'm trying to show is people the impact long term of where we're at. The one that I'm actually even more interested in, well, sorry, that's a 400% difference. The one that I'm more interested in is because capital growth is something that I can't necessarily bank on, which I think is asking the question that you're answering. Whereas income is pretty much, well, it's not guaranteed, but it's the thing that's important. That's what I can manage, that's what I can control. And doing that exact same research, you'll actually see that South Africa was doing better than Australia, and then unfortunately started to dwindle, and currently we would be sitting at about 80,000-90,000 rand passive income per month in South Africa, and about 220,000 in Australia. And again, I do have all the research now for America, so as soon as I update that, I'll send it through to you in terms of where we're actually at. And it's a 250% difference. So this graph, you can't see it. I did this on the webinar the other night, and so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it. But all that I wanted to show, is there anyone in the room that is thinking like I was thinking? So, right, damn it, should have bought 3 months ago when the rand was 8.99 rand. Tell you what, I'll wait for a year because it's going to recover to 9 rand at least. Anyone feel like that? Okay, yeah, 100%. It's common sense in terms of that. So what I thought to myself is, okay, because, you know, the one thing I learned from Hannes Dreyer is that don't rely on sentiment, put the numbers down and actually, you know, do the comparisons. So I did a scenario planning, and what I thought to myself is, I thought, right, we've got 2 scenarios here. So if I buy a house in Atlanta today, cash, it's going to cost me $120,000. The average growth in America for the last 30 years has been 9.75. In Atlanta at the moment, it's actually quite a lot higher than that on a per annum basis. But let's be conservative and just work on the long-term average at 10%. The net return, let's work on a 9% net return. The rand is currently, the gentleman at the back said it's 10.10. I'm just going to work on 10 to make it easy. Best case scenario, even though James says the best case scenario is the rand will recover to 9.30, I'm going to say it gets even better. It recovers to 9. And I'm going to say the worst case is that it gets to 11. So if you wait a year, and I'll email this through to you if you're interested. If you wait a year, the property would have gone up by 10%, so it'll cost you $132,000. And in rand terms, for the 2 gentlemen sitting at the table there, you'll only be timesing that by 9 rand now, because remember, it's best case scenario. Happy? Yep. So it'll give you an amount of money. The amount of rands you would have to spend in a year would be 1.188. Okay. So the second scenario is that you buy now, and you benefit from the capital growth on the property and the income. Because remember, the capital growth is a variable, but the net income is a fairly constant. So it gives you a return, but I'm not so worried about the return, because this scenario is where the rand stays exactly the same. Nothing changes. The rand in a year is at 10 rand to the dollar. Does it make sense? And interestingly enough, just on income, you're 8% better off. And if you take income and capital, you're 18% better off. But the one that's the most important for me is scenario 3. And scenario 3 is the difference between buying now at 10 rand to the dollar, or waiting a year and buying in a year at 9 rand to the dollar. And interestingly enough, if you buy now at 10 rand to the dollar, but you benefit from the income that you would earn on the property, you will still be 7% better off than if you wait, hope and pray that the rand recovers to 9, and even if it does recover to 9, and you buy then, you would still be 7% better off than if you bought today at 10. Does that make sense? And that's without capital growth. The last scenario, well, there's two more scenarios. Scenario 4 is where you buy now and the rand doesn't decrease, it actually gets worse, and it shows you that you're getting quite a stark contrast. And then lastly, scenario 5 is where it's very difficult to get financing in America, but if you could get financing and if you could leverage at 50%, it shows you that your return in terms of, even if the rand improves to best case scenario, so even in a year's time if the rand improves to 9 and you buy today at 10, you're still better off if you leverage it than, and your total return is obviously higher because you're benefiting from the leverage effect. Now, just to show you, I did all those scenarios, and just like Brendan spoke about, you can see all the numbers there. I wanted to work out my net asset value in dollar terms. I don't really care what my net asset value is in rand terms. For me, it's irrelevant because it can't determine whether all the things I said earlier. So I wanted to work out my net asset value in dollar terms. And I turned it into what I called the freedom graph. And I'm going to put it on the PowerPoint because it's easier to see. But basically, in simple terms, the first scenario is where I leave my money in the bank at an 8% return. So in South Africa, and I leave it for the next 30 years. So from 2013 to 2043, I'd have a net asset value of about 250,000 US dollars. That's if I invested 1.2 million rand today. Make sense? Happy? If I bought a South African property, and I don't know if you know this, but the 30-year average in South African capital growth is 12%. And so what I worked on was the 30-year average of 12%, and I worked on a net yield of 8%. Is that fairly good, just in terms of fairness, in terms of what we could get at home? Yes, no? Yep. So if I invested 1.2 million rand with those type of returns over the next 30 years, my net asset value would be about 770,000 US dollars. Option 3 is if I wait a year and the rand recovers to 9 rand to the dollar and I invest in a year. You can actually see the green line when it starts a year later. My net asset value if I buy a property in America would be about $2 million. If I buy today at 10 rand to the dollar and I benefit from the income, and this is the advantage of compound growth, I will have about $2.3 million. And then lastly, if I take out a mortgage, then in America I get the leverage effect. And the difference really is 222% between leaving my money in the bank and buying a South African property. It's 174% between buying a South African property and waiting a year. It's another 10% better to actually take action today than wait a year and hope that the rand recovers. And lastly, it's another 79% if I look at something where I can get financing. And just to show you the stark difference between the bottom and the top, it's 16 times better. Or between the South African property and the American property, it's four times better. So, for another award, can anyone give me the definition of the difference between local investing and offshore investing? Rand hedge? Yep. It's actually a formula. No?
Equals MC².
Excellent. Just before I move on, I moved over those numbers pretty quickly. Did that graph make sense? Does it make sense? Does anyone disagree with it or want to debate it before we move on? No? Okay. So, this was a formula. I'm a German boy, so I am going to warn you right up front that my Afrikaans is not that brilliant. But I'm always told the saying, ver van jou goed na jou skade. Which, from what I understand, is if your goods are a long way away from you, you're going to lose them. Now, I know that there's a lot of people in this room thinking, yeah, Scott, all those graphs are lekker, but how the hell am I going to manage something sitting on the other side of the ocean? Yes, no? Okay. So for me, the definition of local investing Is Fairfontein good? La on your SCADA, minus 21%. Because this year, from the 1st of January to today, we've lost 21%, the rand to the US dollar. So unfortunately, I'm not being negative, but I hope you worked hell of a hard since the 1st of January and made more than 21%, because otherwise you might as well sit on the beach. It's the truth, unfortunately. That's the facts. For me, offshore investment, an offshore return, is first world asset growth plus first world income, which equals wealth preservation and global wealth, plus peace of mind, plus plan B. And that for me is what I do and why I do it in terms of where I am.